Again, Jeff Benson coming to you, as I said earlier, from Jacksonville, Florida. Really appreciate you taking the time today. We know your time is valuable to talk about this, and we're going to get into this coverage in a lot of detail today. This is going to, I might violate some of my rules because we're going to actually have to look at the exact language in the policy, and this is about as technical as builder's risk can get. So we're going to really dive deep into this. If you have more questions, which I'm sure you will, I'm available at any time. Give me a call, send me an email, because we probably won't get to all the questions today. So I'm going to date myself a little bit. So I grew up in the business many years ago, and at that time we called it time element coverages or business interruption. And the old business interruption forms we had business interruption, we had extra expense. You could write them separately, or there was a form where you could combine BI and extra expense. And that's how I learned the business. Well, over the years, it's kind of evolved into something a little different. So today, what we are going to do is analyze the AAIS form, which is the American Association of Insurance Services Delay in Completion form. So I just picked this form because this is what we use in our program. As always, I will tell you, whatever product you're selling, you need to understand that form because there could be nuances that are different than what we talk about today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the soft cost and delay in completion form. And just to give you an idea, this is a coverage part attached to a form, and it's 8 pages long. So I'm sitting here looking at it, and we're going to dive into it, and I'll highlight some of the things. And at the end of this, we'll have time for a Q&A. Oops, I went too far. Hang with me. Previous. No, I didn't. First slide. All right, so the delay in completion form consists of this, okay? So, and I think this is what I want to spend a few minutes on. So a lot of people think that delay in completion kind of stands on its own. Actually, it's a coverage apart that's attached to a form, and in this case, attached to the builder's risk form. And the key to this is a lot of times today, we're going to refer, the wording will say subject to all of these things on this screen. So what that means is, even though these things are not actually all in the delay and completion coverage part, they are in the builder's risk form. And that's why you not only have to know delay and completion, you also have to know the coverage form that it's being attached to. And this will all make sense in a little bit because I'm going to have some wording for you. But these are all we had a webinar a few weeks ago where we talked about the different parts of a policy. So all of these things apply to delay and completion, even though they're not in the delay and completion form. Stay with me on this, we'll talk about it. So when you first look at this, you got to understand there's certain definitions in delay and completion. This is built into the form, and these are the main ones that are defined. And I'm not going to read you all of those. After the webinar, if you want a copy of the form, drop me an email and we make sure we'll get you a copy of the AAIS form. Today we're talking about the AAIS form. It's edition date 9/11. So that's the one that we're on. So the one I really want to talk to you about today is the delay period. So the delay period is one of the keys to understanding delay and completion. So the definition says delay period means the period of time the completion of the construction, erection, or fabrication of a covered building or structure is delayed, and here's the whole crux of the whole thing, as a result of direct physical loss or damage caused by a covered peril to property covered under the builder's risk coverage form, which this coverage part is attached. So it's kind of what I was talking to before. We get this discussion all the time in the national media talking about business interruption, delay and completion. The whole key to this coverage is understanding that this is a coverage part attached to a form, and it goes back to that form. So the number one thing is there must be direct physical loss caused by a covered peril. If there's not direct physical loss caused by the coverage, there is no coverage under this form. And I think you guys know what I'm driving at. I really don't want to get into all of the details of the current situation of what we're in, because there really isn't a lot of precedent, but let's just focus on that. So when you ask me a coverage question, the first thing in my mind is I'm going to ask, is there a direct physical loss, and is it a covered peril on the coverage form? So that's, you answer that, and then it starts making sense to you. Okay? There is some exclusions built into this form, and we're going to get into that a little bit to fine tune it. So sometimes there's coverage on the main form, but then on the delay in completion, they've redefined some of those exclusions. And we'll get through some of that too, as we call it. You know, so it really does, that's what the key is. This is the other definition that we're talking about here is where did I go here? Got a little confused here on the waiting period. And the waiting period is just that. It's kind of like a deductible. So how long do we wait until the coverage takes place? You've heard that. Sometimes the time element coverage is on a BOP. They have a week waiting period, so on and so forth. The limit, we're going to talk about the limit, the different coverage parts of the limit in a few minutes. So the limit is critical, and it can be either a limit based on time. You have so much coverage for 30 days, or it could be an occurrence limit. You have so much coverage for any one occurrence. And the virus exclusion, we all know about that. So you go back to the main coverage form, and whatever form you're selling, you need to read that virus exclusion. There'll be some wording in that form, and that exclusion would apply to the delay in completion because it's excluded on the main coverage form. I know it seems a little redundant, but I think we need to spend a little time on that. Coverages. As I said earlier, we used to have business interruption. We called it BI and extra expense and this and that, but now these things have changed. So in the form that we're talking about today, the AEIS form, these are the main coverage parts. First one, additional construction expenses. I'm going to kind of simplify that because there's just a few of these additional expenses, but it's really a subset of soft costs. Okay, so additional construction expenses consist of advertising fees, design fees, financing, lease administration, and professional fees. Okay, these are expenses that would reoccur in the event of a loss. Go back to that, was there a direct physical loss by a covered peril? If there was, then you had to rebuild what you'd already built, and these expenses reoccurred. These are the ones that are built into it. So additional construction expenses really are a subset of soft costs. The other piece of this form, it says additional soft costs. So, and the additional soft costs on the form are interest payments, realty taxes, lease expenses, and insurance premiums. So those are the two things. The other piece of what we're going to talk about today is really what limit you should pick. The biggest mistake I see agents making every day is someone's building a $500,000 building and they want $2 million in soft costs. And I'll say to them, why? Well, we think it's a good idea. Well, the first thing you got to do is, you know, what are we talking about? What's covered under soft costs? And then how much are there? So we're going to talk about a worksheet in a little while and determining what the proper limit is. And I'll give you some tips. But there's no point in insuring something that, you know, putting a limit in there when there's no coverage for it. Okay, the next piece of this is rental income. Okay, rental income is just that. We're going to build something. We're going to build a hotel, or we're going to build a strip center, and we're going to have tenants, and we're going to generate rental income. But because of a covered loss, a direct physical loss, covered peril, we have a delay, so we're going to lose that rent we would have made had we finished the project on time. Another, you should probably do a little accounting worksheet on that. What is the rent? Okay, so, and that is, you know, they're going to pay for the actual loss of rental income during the delay period. Always go back to that delay period. We talked about that too. And once again, you can put this on a 30-day limit, or you can have an occurrence limit. You know, if you limit how much you pay in any 30 days, then you get a break on the rate. There's a little less coverage, obviously. So that's another way of looking at that. The other one is income coverage. You're going to build a building and generate income from it other than rental income. So maybe you're the owner of a building, you're going to generate it, you're going to have your own business in there. Because of covered loss, direct physical loss to the property during the construction, you have a delay period, you lose income. So get that idea. So the further thing you got to ask yourself is, who's your insured? Is it the contractor? Is it the owner of the building? Is it the developer? who's your insured, and how do they generate income from this project. So really those are the major coverage parts. The optional coverages are things that are probably built into the main form, but if you want to add additional coverages, you can do it through optional coverages that apply only to delay and completion. Things like sewer backup and things like that. So I don't spend much time on the optionals. They should be covered in the main form with a sublimit. So you can't handle it on this form if you want. So let's keep going. Coverage extensions. Expenses to reduce a loss. Okay, so you can expend, you're going to have an expense, you got to go hire people in order to reduce the loss. So that's a limit that you can pick. Some of these are covered in the main form. So you just got to, a lot of things, the one thing I can't cover today is how this form interacts with any other company form. So you have to know, first of all, how ordinance and law is handled on the main form. For example, in our form, we build in $1 million automatically with no charge. So that would be translated into delayed completion. So it's a little complex there, but that's why I can't handle that. You have to actually know what the main form covers. General administrative expenses. This is a supplemental coverage that's built into the form. You can pick a limit for that. And, you know, usually this form, the way we use it, it's $50,000 limit. So just general administrative expenses, cost of general and overhead expenses for additional clerical personnel, additional security costs, other similar expenses incurred during the delay period. Might be a nice coverage if you want to have that. This is critical because we're going to get into some of this when we get into some of our examples. I'm sure you'll have questions on this, but what perils are excluded? Once again, go back to the main form. All the perils that are excluded on that main form are also excluded on the delay and completion form. Remember that. Did a little investigative work too. The way we handle earthquake and flood in our program is it is an endorsement to the existing policy. So if you had earthquake and flood and you have delay in completion, then we'll know that. On the form, that box will be checked. So you would actually have coverage for that, for those perils, because they're covered on the main form. Okay, some of the things that are not covered by delay in completion. Additional time that would be required to replace or repair any part of a covered building due to adverse weather conditions, and not covered. Improvements necessary to correct deficiencies of original construction, erection, or fabrication. So some of these things, change order, simply because they changed their mind and they're going to do something different that delayed the project, that's not covered. Different than the change order coverage built into the main form, that's a different coverage. Okay. Customs regulations, things of that nature, because of those, you have a delay that is not covered. Okay. These are the questions we get all the time too. Lack of funds. Something happens to the financing, so you have a delay in the project, that is not a covered peril. So it's not covered. Leases, licensing, contracts, or orders. You get the idea that all of these things are not, they don't answer that first main question we talked about. A direct physical loss by a covered peril on the coverage form. Okay. Obviously, property not covered. If the property is not covered, there's no delay in coverage, delay in completion coverage. Unnecessary expenses, I guess that's just something they throw in there. So determining an income coverage loss. This is what we asked a lot of times. How do you determine the amount of the loss? So the first thing is you have to, what are the continuing expenses? We always go back to that. So these are the ones that continue during the delay period. And a lot of times we're saying, where does this information come from? And this is really more of an accounting issue than it is anything else, because you have to prove, the income that you lost. So that's why these worksheets that we'll talk about are great ideas to determine what is the actual, income, rental income, soft costs, what's actually happening. Then it becomes a lot easier to adjust the claim. If you don't have those, if the insured does not cooperate on the accounting side, the claim will not be adjusted correctly, and it's going to take too long. So that's kind of it. Selecting an appropriate limit. Let's talk about that just for a second, because we get asked all the time. Somebody asks for a really high limit, and we'll say why, and they'll say, well, the insured just wants a high limit. I'm like, well, we can give you the limit, but it doesn't make much sense. General rule of thumb, and this is just a general rule of thumb, something we've written a lot of this. It's usually in most residential cases, it's about 10% of the limit on the policy. So if they're building $1 million home, the soft cost, just the soft cost, not the total delay in completion, is about 10%. It's about 100,000, give or take. That usually falls into the right realm. Now, if for just soft costs, if they're asking for 500,000 on $1 million house, we probably have an issue. People don't understand what soft cost is. That's just the soft cost. The other limits for the things we talked about, rental income and income, that can vary dramatically based on what part of the country you're from, and obviously what are the tenants, what are the occupants, what kind of rental income are you going to get? It can be much different. But I do suggest, you're going to have to talk to your insureds. They're going to have to talk to their accountants to get an accurate idea of this, because this coverage is not inexpensive. So I think you want to choose the right limit. Our goal here is never to, I don't ever want to be underinsured, but I don't think we're doing a good job if we're overinsuring these exposures. I want to get the right amount. So there is a right amount here. So go back a little bit. So one of the things you always are asking for a worksheet. If you guys are wanting a worksheet, we do have a couple of examples. I would hate to say though that you give them a worksheet and say this is the actual perfect worksheet. Their own accountant might want to come up with their worksheet. For you, what I would do is go back to the coverage form, what we went on today, and say, okay, what exactly is covered under soft cost? And you can list the things that are covered, and then you go to the insured's accountant and say, if these things reoccur, how much are they? Because they already know how much they're built in to their original construction amount. So that's the way I would handle that. And like I said, rental income and income coverage, there is a number out there. How much is this property going to generate in income? How much is it going to generate in rental income? Then you have the appropriate limit. So that is everything you need to know about delay and completion in 20 minutes, which is kind of a record for me. We could spend a lot of time on this coverage because it's fairly complex, and tried to not read the entire form to you. I do say though, if you're going to sell this coverage, which you all should, because I do think there's a big exposure out there that we need to make sure is covered, and this is a great way to cover it on the builder's risk. This is kind of extends beyond what most people think of hard cost of builder's risk, labor, materials, and overhead. This is a whole other game, and it is a great way to cover the exposure. You just have to make sure it's right. And I'm sitting here looking at the schedule too. So you have a schedule that you attach on the coverage part, and that's a good way of looking at it, because you have the limits. You select a limit for additional construction expense, additional soft cost, rental income, income coverage, and then you have some coverage extensions built into this. But on this schedule, this is where you really select how much coverage there is. And it's a good little summary to make sure you covered it all. So another thing I would probably do is, once I understand the coverage form completely, I would have the schedule with me. So when I sit down and talk to the insured, you have an idea of saying, well, let's talk about this. How much income is this going to generate, and what kind of limit should we have on this? So hopefully that schedule is going to help you out a lot too. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open this up for questions, and take your time, and we'll do our best to answer any questions. Do we have any so far, Darcy?
Hey, Jeff. Yeah, we've got a few questions already. The first one was going back to when you were talking about valuation and determining income coverage loss. You mentioned fire extinguishment. What does this mean?
All right, so let's take a look at that. That was one that I really kind of never really been asked that question before, so bear with me on this. So expenses to put out a fire basically are not covered on delay and completion. Now, does that mean, would it be covered on the main coverage form? Perhaps, you'd have to look at that. But on the delay and completion form, they specifically exclude that peril. I guess they consider fire extinguishment almost a peril, but it's just an excluded peril under this form.
All right, next question. For rental income, can you use an example of an apartment building under construction with rental income of $5 million?
I guess I don't quite, I mean, you know, if the true, and I do think it's net income, so I probably left that out. But once you calculate what the net income there is, it could be $5 million limit is what you need. It would be expensive, but that's what you would need. I don't know if I answered the question correctly, but it could be. And I will say this, once you present this to your insured, the cost of the insurance is very expensive, and they might determine they don't want to insure it, and that's okay, as long as you've documented the fact that you offered them the coverage. That's what it always comes down to. So I don't know if that answered the question or not, but that is rental income.
All right, next question. Can you show any of the forms or worksheets, or do people need to request them?
Yeah, no, I mean, I you just need to request them. So if you're interested, drop me an email and I'll send you the worksheet that a couple of that I've found. There are some out there that, like I said, it's more of an accounting exercise. That's why I try not to say, here's the best worksheet. Because if you leave something out, and then they're going to say, well, you didn't ask me about that. So like I said, I would almost go back to the coverage form and say, okay, what is covered under soft cost? These 8 things are covered. So this is the calculation we have to come up with. How much in the event of a delay, and keep in mind, you're just talking about that delay period. So, you know, what is the delay period? How much coverage do you need during that delay period? But yeah, I mean, request that and I'll send you an example of a worksheet.
All right, next question. Can this form be added to policies that have existing building coverage, or can it only be included on new construction?
Excellent question. I like that. So under the rehabilitation and renovation form, if this coverage part is attached to the rehabilitation and renovation form, the references to building or structure are replaced with rehabilitation or renovation project. So what I said is yes, you just have to make sure if it is, it can be added to a renovation policy. You just probably need to look at things like ordinance and law, which probably don't apply because they're excluded, things like that on a rehab. So there's probably the coverage. It always goes back to the coverage form. So if this is attached to a renovation policy, it has different exclusions, different limitations that would apply. Things like ongoing construction activities. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, the short answer is yes, it can be added. Good question.
All right, next question. How do you treat contingency?
Contingencies. I would have to, the form does not actually define contingencies. So I would have to think about that one. So the best answer there is give me a call, we'll talk about it. You know, sometimes I have to do a little research. I have to understand what you mean by that exactly. So give me a call, we'll talk about it. It's funny when I say that too, you guys actually do call me later. So I do enjoy talking about this and diving deeper. So good question. Give me a call, we'll talk about it.
All right, next question. So consequential damages can include many soft costs. How are they differentiated?
Yeah, it's funny. On the form, it's a little vague, to be honest with you, because it just says perils excluded, consequential loss is excluded. So, I mean, that's a matter of interpretation. That's another one that we probably have to take offline and I talk about a little bit because it doesn't really define it to me. But I do go back to the main thing. There's a direct loss, result of a direct physical loss or damage caused by a covered peril to property covered on the builder's coverage form. So it has to be a result of a direct physical loss. So if it's consequential, it's not covered. But I mean, that's the easy answer. But I think we need to talk about what kind of loss we're talking about. So give me a call, we'll talk about it. I knew there would be a lot of that today because it's just such a, I won't say vague, but there's so many examples of things that we just have to talk about. Good question.
All right, so with loss of rental income, is that net income? And if so, where is interest expense covered?
Good question. It is net income because I remember seeing that in the form and somewhere in the form. And interest payments can be covered under soft costs. But I will say there's some limitations on the interest payments in the form. I'm not going to read you the whole form. You just have to understand that some interest payments are covered under soft costs and some aren't. Hate being vague, guys, but this is what you have to be in this form. So hopefully that helps. All
right. Could you go back over the 30-day versus occurrence soft cost coverage? Does this mean soft cost coverage is for only 30 days versus continued coverage to limit for the occurrence that triggered it?
Okay, now this is a good question. So I'm looking at the schedule of coverages, and under all of the coverage, not just soft costs, it's under rental income and income coverage. This form has two limits. The first limit says 30-day limit. The most we pay for additional soft costs in any 30-day period is X. So you can pick an amount and work it out with the underwriter and say, this is the most, this is all we need for 30 days. The next limit is an occurrence limit, which sometimes can be the same as the 30-day limit. It can be more. You know, it's really up to you to determine, you know, how much coverage they need. You know, and maybe in 30 days, that's enough. That's all they need. So I guess what I'm saying is there's another calculating factor. You could take the occurrence limit, and then it can be subject to a percentage of that in any given 30-day period, 16 2/3 or 33% or whatever it may be. There could be a percent limit on the 30-day limit. So it's pretty flexible when it comes to that, but hopefully that makes sense. So a lot of times they're going to say, hey, whatever delay I get is probably only going to be less than 30 days. So that's all I'm worried about. And that's okay. I mean, that's really the exposure as you sit down and talk to them about that. Good question.
Okay. What if the contractor is moving slow and does not complete on time? Will business income delay in completion respond?
No, I try not to answer claim questions directly, but in my mind, let's go back to what I've been talking about a lot today. The delay has to be the result of a direct physical loss or damage caused by a covered peril to property covered under the builder's risk coverage form to which this coverage part is attached. So simply because the contractor is slow, that is not a covered peril. That is not a direct physical loss to the property, so there would be no delay in coverage covered. And we do get asked that a lot. I understand where you're coming from, but this is not like some kind of surety bond or some kind of other guarantee that work is going to be done on time. This goes back to always being attached to a builder's risk form. Good question. Always go back to that.
All right, Jeff, it looks like that is all the questions we have for today.
Great. Well, I do, once again, as always, really appreciate your time today. I know this one is a little complex. It's kind of hard to talk in generalizations about delay and completion coverage. If I leave you with anything, just make sure you understand the form that it's being attached to and how this form interacts with that, because there's a lot of language that either goes back to that form or clarifies that form's coverage. So that's really the key. And as always, as you get into it, give me a call. We can talk about it in more detail one-on-one. I think that's always the best way. My best advice to you is to pick up the phone and call your underwriters that are writing this coverage for you and have a conversation. Because even the underwriters get confused. I've talked to some underwriters before. They get confused on what's covered and what's not covered and what the limit should be. So it happens to the best of us, trust me. So once again, really appreciate it. Join us for our next webinar. What we're going to do on that one is we're going to talk about commercial building projects, more more involved projects, probably get into delay and completion a little bit on that too. But we'll talk about some of the coverages that are needed when you write, 10, 15, $20 million, maybe municipal projects and things of that nature. So it's going to be more designed for commercial than anything else. But we look forward to talking to you and really appreciate your time today. And oops, already did that. There we are. Next time we might add some video so you guys can look at me when I'm talking. I know that's kind of a scary thing, but we'll see. Maybe we should take a survey and say, do you want me to do video or not? And the only other thing that we're going to talk about a little bit, I might survey it, is we did some poll questions last time. We did not on this one, but I think it was kind of fun. I think you guys liked it. So I think we'll do poll questions next time to get you guys more involved. So really appreciate your time and the questions today, and have a good day. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy. Talk to you soon.